In Mark chapter 11, theologians frame what is going on in that chapter as a Markan sandwich. And what Mark does is he opens one story, tells half the story, inserts a second story, and then comes back and closes the first story. So you have the cursing of the fig tree, the cleansing of the temple, and then the withering of the fig tree. And the intention of the author is to show that these two narratives have the very same meaning. It's the last week in the life of Jesus. He's full of passion. He knows that he's going to die for the sins of the world. He goes to the Temple Mount. He enters it, and you remember how the temple was constituted. The most central part was the Holy of Holies, one man once a year. Then the holy place where the priest would minister. Then the place for the Jewish men, Jewish ladies. But the most peripheral part and the largest aspect of the temple was called the court of the Gentiles, or the court of the nations. And God had designed the temple that all peoples, Romans, Babylonians, Greeks, could come to the court of Gentiles and encounter Jehovah God. So bursting with this passion for the nations, he comes onto the Temple Mount, and what does he find but a marketplace, no place for the nations? And I don't know what your picture of Jesus is, but he wasn't white. He didn't have feathered hair. He didn't walk around with a lamb on his shoulder all the time. He was the Mediterranean God-man, and there are some things that made that God-human blood boil. And here is where we see Jesus, the angriest in all of the scriptures. And I grew up in Africa, was born there, lived in the Arab world all of my life, so I know what a market in Africa or the Arab world looks like. There's donkeys, there's bananas, there's flies, there's incense, there's spices, there's all kinds of things. You can get the stolen cell phones, whatever it is, it's going on there. And do you think it works in an Arab or an African market to go in and say, oh, excuse me, please, we kind of need this for a place of prayer. So would you take those stolen bananas and exit stage left so we can come in and have a prayer meeting? No, Jesus goes postal. He's visceral. He's violent. He's knocking things over. He's yelling. Things are being thrown around. And he quotes Isaiah 56. Don't let the foreigner say there's no place for me in God's house. Don't let the eunuch say, here I am a dry tree. For even in my house will be given to them a place better than sons and daughters. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. And this is what I like to call apostolic nasty. I want to talk with you this morning for 20 minutes about apostolic nasty. Turn to your neighbor and say, what you need is a little bit of apostolic nasty. Now let me define it, because I'm not using it in the archaic term of gross or disgusting. When I say an apostolic nasty, here's what I mean. Have you heard of Tiger Woods? You heard of Muhammad Ali? You heard of Mike Tyson? Or closer to home, Tom Brady or Bill Russell? What made these guys world changers? Larry Bird, what made these guys, at the level of professional athletics, everybody's amazing. If you're going to get there and you got the same coaches and the same weight rooms and the same physiotherapists and the same diets and traveling on the same jets, but at that level, when you win multiple championships, you have to have a little bit of nasty up here, right? Michael Jordan, sure, phenomenal athlete, but if you saw The Last Dance, he's not just going to win game sevens. He's going to beat you at tiddlywinks. He's going to beat your butt at practice. He's going to beat you first in line on the bus. He's going to take your lunch money, and he's going to enjoy doing it, right? He's got apostolic nasty. And I think it's time in the church and in mission that we get our nasty back. We get back a little bit of apostolic nasty. Here's how I define it. A consecrated, not a carnal, a consecrated edginess that fixates on the worth of Jesus and his glory amongst all nations. A consecrated edginess that fixates on the worth of Jesus and his glory amongst all nations. Apostolic nasty. Now you might be saying, okay, that's a one-off deal, Jesus cleansing the temple. 3 chapters before, in Mark chapter 8, he takes his disciples on a missions trip. They go about 30 kilometers north of the Sea of Galilee to Caesarea Philippi. It's a pagan town. It's not a Jewish town. It's nasty. They had a law in the books at some point that to go down Main Street, you had to be naked. They killed their children. It was immoral. They would throw those children, discarded babies, into this pit in a cave, which was euphemistically called the gates of hell. And standing in front of the gates of hell, Jesus makes, on this missions trip to Gentile territory, he makes this proclamation: I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Oh yeah, the disciples like that. Yay, hallelujah, rah, rah, Jesus. And then in the next verses, he says, and in order to do that, I must go back to Jerusalem, I must suffer, and I must die. At which point, Peter takes Jesus aside and says, oh no, Jesus, that will never happen to you. And then the text says, Jesus, looking at the disciples as if to include them in what he says next, he turns to Peter, and what does gentle, flannel graph, Sunday school Jesus say to his disciple? Get behind me, Satan, for you're not mindful of the things of God, but the things of man. How's that for member care? Apostolic nasty. If anything gets in the way of the mission of God to make disciples that make disciples and plant churches that plant churches, Jesus runs it over. And let me remind you that cleansing the temple was his house. I'm not asking you to run other people over. I'm not asking you to criticize other districts. I'm just asking you this: what's in your temple? What's on your phone? What do you do in your private time? How do you organize your house? And if there's clutter and busyness and marketeering and filth and things that don't honor him, if there's anything that's taking away energy from making disciples that make disciples amongst all the nations of the world, you got to cast it out. You got to go a little bit apostolic nasty internally. What's in here? What's in here that is retarding the mission of God in all the earth? You got to go after that thing. Now, maybe you're saying, well, that's Jesus and he's God on the earth. And all right, let's look at Paul. We know that before Paul got saved, he had a little bit of nasty in him, right? He's killing Christians and he's chasing them down Damascus Road. He gets saved. And we think that after that, his whole personality changed and he got all nice and fluffy. After all, he wrote 1 Corinthians 13, right? Love is patient, love is kind, love is. Same dude wrote Galatians. You foolish Galatians. Who has bewitched you that you so soon leave the gospel of grace to follow another gospel? You might as well go the whole way and castrate yourself. Don't get mad at me, that's in the Bible, right? I rebuke Peter to his face. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Guys causing trouble in the church, turn them over to Satan for the redemption of their souls. John Mark, we just heard it, you're off the team. At the end of Corinthians 16, just 3 chapters after the love chapter, if anyone does not love the Lord Jesus, let him be accursed. What is that? In all of those references, something was getting in the way of the mission of God. Something was retarding the making of disciples of all the nations. And wherever Paul found that, he ran it over. Apostolic nasty, a consecrated edginess that fixates on the worth of Jesus and his glory amongst all the nations. We see this in Acts 16. He goes to Philippi. Lydia gets saved. Little church of the brethren in her house. Servant girl has a demon cast out. Marketeers lose their hope for profit. They complain to the magistrates. The text says that Paul and Silas are arrested, stripped, beaten, bloodied, sent to jail. Earthquake happens. Philippian jailer gets saved. And then at the end of that narrative, strangely, the magistrates come back and beg for Paul to leave the city. And at that point, he says, nope, I'm a Roman citizen. Well, what's going on here? In Greco-Roman civilization, you had what's called a patron-client understanding. Patrons had the power, and they would give some type of service, and then clients would give obedience. And in this particular case, at the beginning of the story, the magistrates were the patrons. They had the power. What they did not know was that Paul was Roman. And when he reveals that he's a Roman citizen, they realize they've made a classic blunder because by Roman law, no citizen could be punished without due process. You had to go through a trial. And so they know they're in trouble. And there's this power inversion because all Paul has to do now is go to the governor and say, I was Roman, they beat and bloodied me, but I didn't go through a process of trial, so now go after them. They could lose their status, their job, their income, and their honor in community. So they know they're in trouble, and they're saying, please, Paul, just leave town. I think the question for us is, why did Paul wait to play the Roman card? He didn't have to get bloodied. He didn't have to get beat up. He didn't have to go through all those processes. So why did he wait and not declare his get out of jail free card? And I think the answer for that is given for us in the last verse of Acts 16, because it says right before Paul left town, he went back to the house of Lydia. And what's happening here culturally, I believe, is this. Now that he has the power, now that the magistrates have to honor him, now that they have to cater to him, he goes to Lydia's house, and by that action, he's saying, you see this woman? You see this church in the house? She's with me. I'm leaving town, but if you lift one finger to go after her, I'll come back to town, report you to the governor, and life as you know it is over. Keep your hands off the church. Keep your hands off this lady. She's under my protection. Only possible because he had a little bit of apostolic nasty. He wasn't afraid to bleed a little bit and suffer a little bit for the protection of the nation, the baby church. My question for all of us on this is, are you willing to lay down your Roman card? Nothing wrong with being America. Nothing wrong with sidewalks and green grass and libraries and Chick-fil-A and all the good things that we enjoy. Nothing wrong with having a retirement account. Nothing wrong with having a second car. Nothing wrong with having a cabin on the lake. Nothing wrong with living near grandparents or children so you have free babysitting. Nothing wrong with any of that. But is there anyone here who's willing to lay down that card to make disciples that make disciples that make disciples amongst the nations? If Paul wouldn't have done that, the church is not protected. The Philippian jailer and his family don't get saved. You want to make disciples that make disciples that make disciples amongst the nations? You're going to have to lay down your privilege cards. It's going to have to cost us all something. We need to live with a little bit of apostolic nasty, a consecrated edginess that fixates on the worth of Jesus and his glory amongst all nations.